All right. Well, thank you, Dala, and thank you everyone for organizing this great panel. And I've been learning a lot already. Fascinating talks from fellow panelists. Yeah. So as Dala has asked me, I'd like to share just very briefly a situation on Hong Kong. We'll have another speaker who will cover a little bit of the current feelings in mainland China. And I'll spend most of the time probably just taking a bird's eye view on what we see as looking at the data and looking at the past experiences and parallel crises, what could be future trends for global business. So let me just start with Hong Kong, which has been actually relatively lucky so far. We had just over 1,000 cases, most of them imported. Only 4 deaths, the last one more than a month ago. Now the number of cases down to single digits, and all of them are kind of, they're calling them imported. That is, they are kind of caught at the airport as every incoming traveler is being tested, even asymptomatic ones, and they have to wait until they're allowed entering Hong Kong. So in some sense, since we didn't have a lockdown, similar to Sweden, maybe a little bit more restrictions on gatherings, and the schools were actually closed since January, but no lockdown, and offices were open for most of the businesses. In some sense, it sounds similar to what we can see like a possible future, interim future in the next few months for many of reopening economies in Europe. They'll be very heavily localized. A lot of the still continuing trade in goods, maybe less travel, and people maybe starting eventually feeling much more confident psychologically, as Kęstutis has very nicely put it. So where does this come? Where do we think as observer, being here 8 years and getting a little bit of feeling of Hong Kong culture, I think it's a little bit what Ivaris has told as well on the Ukraine's resilience. Having had a few of these crises in the past, of course, SARS was a big crisis in Hong Kong, much stronger economically, actually, even than today. It was a big shock, and interestingly, the government in Hong Kong resisted. There's no official mask wearing policy in Hong Kong, but everyone's 100% wearing masks because people just took it personally. We don't have to listen to government. We will not listen to government. We'll just take care of ourselves. In some sense, last year you've heard of Hong Kong protests. That might have helped a little bit as well. Prepare for this. In what way? Well, a lot of the firms already had prepared for their working from home policies. If protests hit the streets and we have to shift to working from home, we have this quick way of how to have our workforce, at least those activities, those tasks that can be performed distantly, just switch immediately. In fact, we had already 2 work from home. Again, this was not official policy from government. This is as in Sweden, as Reda has mentioned. This is just what companies, the private firms, are implementing themselves. We had first wave in January and February. Then the situation has a little bit improved. People went back to the offices. We got the second wave. The travelers, or actually Hong Kong residents from US, from UK, from Europe started coming back, and then you got the second wave of the virus, and we switched back to the working from home policies. Again, this is only softly enforced. Many firms have A/B teams. So we have one team that works 1 week from the office, and B team works at the same time from home, and then they switch, and they're not supposed to meet anytime, even socially. They're not supposed to meet for dinner, not supposed to meet for a drink or kids play, right? So critical resources, trading desks are separated from anything. So you figure out the teams sort of like work in silos, so they never meet and they don't contaminate each other if there's a potential infection. I'm part of the European Chamber of Commerce here in Hong Kong, representing Lithuania. And so we did a little survey of European firms And we found that a third of them, it was like 2 weeks ago, a third of them expect the effects to last another 6 months. I was trying to find some Hong Kong data these days. Apparently, most of the macro data is coming in a few days from the government, so I won't have much. But at least from the Purchases Manager Index, we don't see much of the rebound yet. Although, if I walk on the street, I see already some restaurants having like a 30-minute or an hour wait to be seated for dinner. So things are looking good, at least from the casual point of view. How about China? I think we'll hear from esteemed guest from Wuhan more about it. I saw one interesting research that I want to share with you. Just came out 2 days ago, looking at the credit card transactions. UnionPay, which is the major, it's bigger than Visa and MasterCard in China. It's the main credit card system. And they looked into the all offline transactions over this last few months. Of course, there was a big drop of the consumption. So the first few weeks after the Wuhan lockdown, there was a massive, over 100 billion euros lost, 1.2 trillion RMB. But eventually it started rebounding, and if you look into just early April, it pretty much reached the levels it had. Zero is the Chinese New Year, basically. Reached the levels around the Chinese New Year. Now it started going down a little bit, and maybe this is something that has been alluded to by Reda, is that some of the factories realize there's no more demand, so they're starting laying off employees. So unemployment is going down in China. Is going up in China, actually. All right, I have a breakdown according to a few of the categories. There were 5 categories. There was also travel, but it's kind of obvious what's happening with travel. So daily necessities is kind of back after 3 months. Discretionary items down 10% after 3 months. Again, this exclude the online consumption. This is just offline. Durable goods actually went up, even, and now it's around 10% down. But once after the lockdown finished, people went back and started buying durable goods. We hear the stories of Hermes shop in Guangzhou sold $2.6 million sales in one day. People were just crazy buying handbags. Or 40 tons of Boston lobster being flown to Hangzhou next to Shanghai. So these stories catch headlines, but it seems that even looking at the data, there is some sort of rebound in consumption. All right, so we'll hear more about China just in a second. I want to just focus on a few things that Dalia has kindly asked to share my thoughts of where this is going. And I don't know, no one knows, no one has the crystal ball. I think it's hard to say. Health crisis, is it over? We haven't seen reports. I think everyone has saw that in the news, whether this really, if you are sick, you get immunity or not. What does it mean for vaccines if you don't get immunity? All the mutations, all the seasonal waves, although we see that, even with a hot climate, Singapore has experiencing some issues recently. What are the permanent health effects? Permanent lung damage, apparently, that's being suggested by some of the medical journals. Even for the economic and financial crisis, it's hard to tell. And the reason it's hard to tell, I think, is that governments' policies are very hard to predict. And especially if governments react in different countries and they don't synchronize their policies as much, it's somewhat hard to predict how the economies will recover when there's so much dependence on bailout schemes, on currency devaluations, as Kesutis mentioned, central bank policies, and so on. And what one can only imagine if there any political changes coming up. We see a few elections this year, how they will unravel, what kind of people will come into power, what promises will they make. I think this is something important to think about. I will talk briefly, I think, in the probably remaining few minutes that I have on the firm adjustments, just looking from more sort of data on the previous crises and so on. And they look into two adjustments, and I see that Kęstutis and Thomas and Reda and Ivaras has mentioned some of them already, how things are happening in their own companies or in their countries. So on the employees, you know, we've all heard there's a 25 million new unemployment claims in the US. I calculated the breakdown. It's mainly accommodation and food services, 20% of those 25 million. 12% is retail trade, 12% is healthcare, and this is probably relates to what Thomas has mentioned on the private hospitals not being able to operate or do the sort of non-essential services. Manufacturing, 11%. So, you know, if you think about the rebound, some of this will probably go back to work, especially since you can file for unemployment while still being employed and covered by health insurance in the US. So you're on furlough, you're not getting salary, so you're getting unemployment benefits. So if things having a V type of recession, they might go back pretty quickly. So this is not as worrying as actually it looks. Like even Hong Kong, you know, record high unemployment rate, 4%. It's not terrible. There's people are not like really having crisis in employment yet. What else I've been seeing is kind of inverted pyramid salary cuts. So, you know, the top example, this particular example, I think was from the Emirates, the airline, the top brass employees get like 100%, take a 100% pay cut, and then 75%, 25% cut. And so the lowest salary employees feel confident that they will stay employed at least through these couple of months. And, you know, these salary cuts at the top level, we've been seeing, you know, all around the world, at least 1 month's salary is being suggested. Especially if you noticed the CARES Act, the bailout scheme of the US. If you're taking any money from the bailout scheme, you know, there's strict salary restrictions at the $425,000 US level, which is not that high, you know, for the US top executives. And at $3 million level, there's another restriction. So, so I think that's something that's going to happen in the shorter term. I think that kind of might be relevant for the executives. So what's in the shorter term? Of course, contingencies for further waves. Maybe some, you know, we learned Zoom, you know, just now, but maybe there's like a more optimized work from home policies. You know, maybe this, you know, better feeling that we have about the health situation than currently of improving health situation is the time to think about the second wave and prepare for more optimized distant work situations. In the longer term, I think it's clear that post-COVID economy will have very different demand and probably different types of firms. You know, wages versus employees, whose wages, which employees. At some point of time, the executives will have to be making decisions on those. Maybe thinking of the risk management perspective, focus, you know, think about the optimal composition of part-time versus full-time employment. You know, maybe we need to push for more flexible labor code or less flexible labor code in the future in the economy. There's something to think about for sure. I looked a little bit.
If I can just ask you to shortly wrap it up.
Yeah. All right. So I'll just have one more thing on this, and then I'm moving to the supply chain, which was just 1 minute. Okay. Wonderful. So one thing that we've also seen in the US a lot is the succession planning. So what happens if the CEO gets sick, basically, or the top management gets sick? So there's something to think about. Now in the supply chains, also there's been a lot of mentioned, that's pretty much the last thing I want to talk about, is, you know, pre-COVID, we had this just-in-time production, specialization, low inventories. There's been a lot of talk about the globalization. Thomas has already mentioned it. Will the supply chains will be further deglobalized? There's some thoughts that more of them will move to Eastern Europe or back to the US or, you know, somewhere near shore. There was less risk of, or back home in your home country, less risk of any supply chain disruptions. But on the other hand, you know, maybe you want to diversify your suppliers, have more potential suppliers, you know, BCDE plan, like Kęstutis has mentioned, which in case if pandemic hits your country, you don't want to have your suppliers in your country or your factories in your country. So in fact, I have looked into the SARS just today, just checked the news for all US publicly listed firms. I know their supplier countries, and around 2003, we saw that the number of suppliers for the companies that had previous suppliers in Hong Kong or China in 2003, they started diversifying their supply chains compared to other countries in their industry. So, so just to wrap it up, I think that it's all about building resilience and all about risk management in the future. I think more of the firms will be thinking about that. And of course, there's a big trade-off of optimizing your operations in a static way today versus thinking about these low probability events that might happen. And this will be sort of the topic of the boardroom discussions in my mind in the nearest future. Thank you.